So again, my name is Stephanie Smith. I'll be discussing the CalARP and RMP PSM deficiencies, more common deficiencies we've seen, as well as a regulatory update on what's been happening with the federal and California programs. I will be focusing on the ammonia refrigeration facilities, which is implied that I'll also be focusing on Program 3 elements. These are all deficiencies. This whole conversation and webinar is applicable to pretty much everybody, especially the ammonia facilities, ammonia refrigeration. But if you do have a facility in a different program level, some of this may still apply, so I encourage that you still pay attention to those elements that may not be applicable directly to your facility. The risk management professional slide summarizes our key services, background, qualifications, and locations. This is just a brief SOS on what our company does, where our specialties are, and we just like to include this for reference for your use later. And we do have an extensive network of affiliates, so even if something isn't listed and you have a need, please feel free to call us. We do a lot of typical outside of the box projects, and they may not be listed on our key services. However, we will get our affiliates involved as needed to be able to do those for our clients. Our key topics today are to discuss briefly the Program 3 element overlap, any periodic requirements that are typically required in Program 3 programs. We'll discuss the common program deficiencies that we've observed here at Risk Management Professionals that were listed in the EPA enforcement alert recently, and summarize some of the revised CalARP regulations that became effective at the beginning of the year. If you're not aware of these changes, you could be deficient already just based on the fact that they went into effect through the year. So it is important that we listed these as potential deficiencies in this webinar. I'll also go over a regulatory update with the current status of where everything is to our knowledge, any potential changes that we foresee, just discussing with our contacts at the federal and state agencies, and any suggested facility actions for those facilities who may be concerned with what the future regulations hold. This slide presents the prevention program overlap. As you can see, we have 2 federal and 2 state for California programs that have regulations that overlap quite extensively. We'll discuss the more conservative regulations in California for the most part. However, with the general duty clause at the federal level, it is very likely that these would be required at the federal level as well, which is why we always cover everything. For periodic requirements, there are obviously ongoing requirements whenever there's a process change. There are also annual review and update requirements for operating procedures and emergency plans. Those include the emergency action plan and the emergency response plan, depending on your facility's response measures. There's also the triennial or 3-year updates or audits, and those include the compliance audit and also refresher training for your personnel at the facility. Every 5 years, in regulations, you're required to submit a CalARP or RMP submittal, sometimes both if you're in California. There's also the hazard assessment, or otherwise known as the off-site consequence analysis, and the process hazard analysis, or if you're a Program 2, would be the hazard review. And again, we're going to be talking about Program 3 elements today, and the seismic assessment in California. So we'll move on to our common program deficiencies, and they're specific to ammonia refrigeration. Again, these deficiencies this list is going to include those observed by us here at Risk Management Professionals, those listed in the U.S. EPA enforcement alert that was published for February of this year, so this month, and those revised regulations that went into effect in California on January 1st. So for the CalARP RMP submittal, we typically see that the submittal is either not completed or not submitted to the agency in a timely manner. And by that, we mean that it's not submitted on time by the anniversary date. The management system is frequently not in place. that's really important, especially if you have frequent changes to management or to personnel. There needs to be a new submittal for each change. Those changes are considered administrative changes, so they will not reflect back on your anniversary date. That will not change when you make an administrative change. However, you do need to update more frequently if you have more frequent personnel changes. And that's important to note. The emergency responders and the EPA, OSHA, they all use this information to have facility contacts and to also know what the facility is doing. And if your information is not up to date, they won't be contacting the right person if there's any issues or concerns with the data that's submitted. For the hazard assessment, we typically see this description of the alternative release scenario that's not present. And when it is present, you always need to ensure that both the worst case and the alternative case scenarios meet the requirements listed in sections 2750.3 and 2750.4 in the CalARP regulations. There's also the revalidation for the hazard assessment. Typically, most commonly, there would be a failure to update the population based on the most recent census information, which currently is the 2010 census. We also see that in California, especially the LA and Orange County region, the list of sensitive receptors in a map will not be included with the submittals, and that's really important for the region. They like to have phone numbers to call in an emergency if there's evacuation orders and whatnot, to be able to warn the public. And a map helps indicate, who's closest to the facility and what kind of facilities are there involved. For the process safety information, P&IDs are very important. If they're missing or they don't reflect changes in the process, it can be very difficult to figure out what's going on at the facility. It's very important to have these updated. They also need to be updated for each PHA. So at a very minimum, even if you're not reviewing them annually like recommended and required, you should be reviewing and changing them as necessary on a 5-year cycle for the PHAs. And that's something we see frequently with risk management professionals. It can be very difficult for facilities, especially when you have older P&IDs, but this is really important to have them put together, especially if there's emergency or there's other hazards at the facility. We also, with the process safety information, especially during compliance audits, we see a lack of documentation, and you'll hear this a lot this morning on this webinar about documentation. It's all about documentation. Make sure that you have release system design information in your PSI section. Make sure that you're in compliance with RAGAGEP, which is the Recognized and Generally Accepted Good Engineering Practices. If it's best practice in the industry, you should be doing it. Even if it's not explicitly required by the regulation, it's implied by the general duty clause. You need to be paying attention to that. Make sure that the electrical area classifications and distribution system information is all listed. That there are chemical reactivity hazards, and if any codes and standards are used during the design, that those are listed as well. A lot of this information can also be covered with the safety data sheets, which were formerly the material safety data sheets. I know that with the change of requirements, there's a lot of different information that's now required that some MSDSs previously didn't have, that now the SDSs are required to all have. So just pay attention to that and make sure that you have all your information listed. You don't have to reiterate the information. You need to at least attach an SDS to the program or have it on file easily so people can reference it, especially your emergency responders. For the process hazard analysis, the PHA should be conducted by a knowledgeable person in the process, or at least be involved. Sometimes that's multiple people, but knowledgeable person needs to be present that has the knowledge of the hazards of the facility, possibly someone that's worked there for several years that understands the ins and outs of the operations. You need to make sure that you're identifying your hazards properly, that there's an understanding between the codes that were used during design and the codes that are currently in place. If there's any updates or upgrades that need to be done to the system, that those are considered and followed through with in recommendations. That you know the location of your emergency shut-off location and evaluate that. If your emergency shut-off location is in a maintenance room, a mechanical room, or the operations, and it could be in a hazardous atmosphere. If it's in the same room as, say, your ammonia tank, that could be a potential hazard, and especially if you don't have people trained to go into a hazardous atmosphere, it's really important that you consider installing an emergency shutoff outside of that area, possibly on your way out the door in an evacuation. We've seen a few facilities starting to do that. I think that's becoming more common practice for the safety of their employees and reducing their liability in case there is an emergency. Also, ensure that the pressure relief devices are located where ammonia is not going to be sprayed or come in contact with any people who are trying to evacuate, trying to respond to an emergency. Those should all be located out of the way, possibly outside the building if you're in a building. And that's up to the design engineers to figure out where the best place is, but also to evaluate during the PHA and make sure everything's safe. And also make sure that old industry standards are brought up to date, and that any old controls or outdated systems be replaced as necessary if they present a hazard. Again, with the process hazard analysis, we're talking about hazards in the facility and what could cause an accident or what could delay a response. We also typically see that recommendations are not closed in a timely manner. Right now, the CalARP regulations require that you agree upon a timeline with the administrative agency. It be conducted, or they be completed within 2.5 years of the PHA or during the next turnaround. And that's now explicitly listed in the CalARP regulation, so it's really important to keep that in mind, that you are being held to a set timeline, of whatever that may be, with the new regulations in place. Continuing on with the PHA, we sometimes see a lack of documentation for closed recommendations. Again, we're going back to the documentation aspect of this, that if it's not in writing and it's not on file, it doesn't count whether you did it or not. And it's really important to remember that. You can say you did something all you want, but if you don't have a piece of paper to prove it, the regulatory agencies are not going to accept it. So you need to keep these recommendations, whether they're closed or not, on file for the life of the process. They also must include a completion date. We highly recommend also including a person who's responsible for the completion, someone who's going to follow up with the changes or upgrades that are being made. Frequently we see that the 5-year update is not completed by the anniversary date. That's typically a scheduling issue, and it's really important to remember, especially if you use an outside consultant, that it could take up to 3 months or more to get something like this scheduled. You've got a team of people you got to get together, and everyone's busy, obviously, especially in operations. And it's really important to keep that in mind, that just because it's due next week does not mean you could get it done by next week, maybe because of scheduling, maybe availability. You could have technical problems. You may need somebody from, the owner is out of town that week and they need to be present. So you need to keep all of this in mind, and it's very frequently it's much easier to just plan ahead and complete it before the anniversary date, even up to a month before, and schedule it early, and then you move up your anniversary date by a little bit for the next cycle, but it's not really hurting anything and you're done on time. Also, frequently human factors in facility siting isn't done. And it's really important to make sure you cover all the items listed in the regulations. There is a list, and human factors and facility siting aren't included. There is also a restriction now with the CalARP regulations that revalidations may only be performed once between full PHA. So basically every 10 years you can do a revalidation, and the times in between you do full PHA. That's pretty much good practice. A lot of companies like ours, we typically err towards the more conservative side, and although we're doing a revalidation, we treat it like a new PHA to make sure that we're covering all our bases and going over everything. But it's important to remember that there is a regulatory requirement for that now in California. Also, facility siting, when conducted, should be based on current design specifications and standards. You don't want to be using old codes and standards. It's like, everything should be current to current building code or best practice through the relative agencies. I know IAR releases bulletins, and there's a few other agencies out there that also give some guidance on that. Also, a generally accepted, industry accepted approach should be used, and it should be used correctly. And there should be a consistent consideration between scenarios and risk ranking throughout the entire PHA for the facility. Moving on to operating procedures. Operating procedures should not be outdated, and an annual review should be performed. This is frequently documented with a simple sign-off sheet. If there are no changes, that's great, but you still need to prove that you reviewed them annually. So, something like a sheet that's in the same binder or on your computer somewhere that, for whoever's in charge of this, saying, hey, yes, I reviewed it on March 1st, 2015, and you sign off on it, means that you're doing it and you have a piece of paper to document that. Again, we're going back to the documentation that everything needs to be written down and proven. These operating procedures also need to be synchronized with what's going on in the field with the operators. And each phase of operation should be covered, including temporary operations if there are any. Emergency shutdown job procedures should be very clear. If there's certain people responsible for different tasks or different things, they need to be laid out very clearly in the operating procedure as well as in your emergency plan. Acceptable alarm set point ranges should be indicated very clearly. We frequently see that missing from the documentation. Procedures should be in the language of the user. So if you have personnel that do not speak English, they need to be in that other language for them to use. This is very important, and if it's their first, if let's just say they speak Spanish, their first language, even if they understand English, if they can't understand the operating procedures in English, they need to be translated to Spanish. And this is required by the regulation. Consequences of deviation are frequently not included in these operating procedures, and they should be on each procedure. And safe work practices should always be followed. For training, we frequently see that training documentation is not on file, and that doesn't mean it wasn't done, but again, we're going back to being able to prove that you did it. It could be a simple certificate or sign-in sheet from a training, quizzes that were taken, or an evaluation sheet that was done to evaluate the performance of that operator, but something needs to be kept on file that the training was conducted and how it was conducted. It needs to cover maintenance procedures, even if you go to an outside contractor for maintenance, there are still going to be some basic procedures for the operators to assist the maintenance personnel. So it may be that they're turning valves. It may be that they're just supervising. But there should be a procedure and training in place for all of that, no matter how simple it may be. And records need to verify that operators understand these procedures. So again, we're going back to quizzes. Oral verification with an oral quiz or just a discussion and sign off on it, or field observation, something to verify that that operator has understood the training that they've been given, and that they know what to do in the situations they've been trained to do, whether it be emergency, regular operations, temporary operations, whatnot. And again, the training needs to be in the language of the operator or user. So if you have someone with a second, English as a second language, even if they speak English and they understand it pretty well, if they don't understand their training in English, it needs to be provided in that other language. For mechanical integrity, written procedures need to be available, complete, and implemented. We frequently see that it's not, and this goes for even when you use contractors for maintenance activities. Inspection and maintenance should be performed and documented. They need to be standardized and consistent with industry standards. Frequently in the EPA enforcement alert, they've noted pipe corrosion issues and pipe security not being addressed. They've also indicated that ice buildup has not been addressed in these maintenance procedures. So these are things to keep in mind, that if you don't have procedures for, your maintenance contractor does not have procedures for, that they need to be documented. And equipment deficiencies should be corrected in a safe and timely manner. If there's an upgrade that needs to be done, a process that needs to be changed, all this needs to be done within a good time frame. The maintenance needs to be scheduled with the contractor if that's who's doing it, and it needs to be on a schedule. So again, going back to documentation and follow through. Quality assurance should be in place. There should be some kind of third check on all the work, or second check, and everything should be verified that's been conducted appropriately. There should be sufficient information available for piping and equipment hazards, and develop a maintenance program around those. If there's certain procedures that need to be done during maintenance, or certain supervision or awareness, all that should be documented in the procedure that's in place. And the facility should verify that you have adequate ventilation during operations and also at any other time that may be necessary. For management of change, frequently this procedure is not even used. And it's really important to remember that if there's any change to the process that's not a change in kind, that you do need to have a procedure documented and in practice and used. The prevention program may lead to prevention program changes and documentation changes. Again, if it's not written down and you don't document what you've done, it doesn't count. So you could still be cited for things even if you've done them and you just don't have the paperwork. Also, if there's any personnel that need to be notified of any changes, that all needs to happen. That ties into some of the other elements such as training, maintenance, and employee participation. So all that needs to be considered when you go through an MOC process. If there's a need for modification or in the operating process or maintenance, that all needs to be addressed during this period as well. While the change is occurring or while you're proposing a change, what other changes to other elements will need to take place. And the MOC procedure should be completed before startup. So this isn't something you do after the fact when you're all done. If you have already installed the new equipment or whatever it may be, it needs to be done before that, the planning process. That's what the intent of this element is for. The pre-startup safety review, again, the procedure is frequently not documented. There should be some kind of form or checklist or procedure in place to do the PSSR. Documentation, again, needs to be kept on file, and when it's completed, it needs to be signed off on, and the implementation and follow-through needs to be documented. It needs to be conducted prior to startup, but after and independent of the MOC. So this is supposed to be a back check, basic quality assurance check on the MOC process. Was everything done correctly? Was the equipment installed? Were procedures changed? Were the employees notified? Everything that needs to go into that. This is the final check before you start up the system again. And it's really important to remember that and to document everything. For the compliance audit, recommendations now have a required timeline as well under the CalARP regulation. And frequently they are not corrected or completed on time. Again, there's an agreed upon timeline with the administrative agency that's allowed, as well as the requirement to complete them 1.5 years following the compliance audit or during the next planned turnaround. And all these apply to whatever occurs sooner. So it's important to keep that in mind, especially with changes that deal with safety. You probably want to get them done sooner rather than later. The compliance audit should always be completed before the anniversary date. It doesn't necessarily mean the report would be completed by then, but the audit needs to be done by then, and it's implied in the regulations. However, you should really have everything done by the anniversary date if you can. The documentation should include audit scope, methods, and findings. And this is new to the CalARP regulations. Previous to this, they only specified that findings had to be documented, and now they're requiring that you document and report the methodology that was used, how you did it, what was included. That's typical of our reports here at Risk Management Professionals, but not typical necessarily of all facilities. So it's important to remember that. Program implementation should be verified with facility personnel. They should know where this documentation is for the entire program, and they should be able to review this compliance audit, especially, and know what the deficiencies may be. The recommendations should be documented and included in the report, and they need to be kept for the most recent 2 compliance audits at a minimum. We highly recommend you keep them longer than that if you can file them away somewhere, especially if it's just on your computer as an electronic file. but the most recent 2 compliance audits must be kept with the program documentation until the 3rd one or the next one would be conducted. For incident of investigation, again, we go back to no follow-through on recommendations. You're seeing this obviously a lot, as well as the documentation aspect of the deficiencies. There is an agreement on a timeline with the administrative agency. There's also a due date of 1.5 years following the investigation or 2 years following the incident, whichever is earlier, or during the next planned turnaround. Again, they're setting timelines for this because they want to be able to hold people to a specific time to make corrections and finish the recommendation changes. Findings should be shared with all affected personnel, even if it's administrative staff that may not be aware of emergency evacuation procedures. If there's been a change and the investigation pertains to them, they need to be notified and provided the information as well. The investigation should always be initiated within 48 hours of the incident. There are also reporting requirements to the federal and state agencies that are involved, and those numbers can be found on all the agency websites. There's required information that should be documented in the report that's outlined in the regulations. Typically, a form type of report to start the incident investigation with possible attachments is very useful. You create it once and leave it blank, and then you can use it for any incidences that occur. There also needs to be investigation and documentation of near misses. Near misses are incredibly important because just because you didn't have an incident, or what most people would think of an accident, doesn't mean you couldn't have had one if it was a near miss. It could just be 1 or 2 things that went right that made it a near miss versus an incident. And it's really important to note that any kind of close calls need to be treated as incidences. They need to be investigated and documented in the same manner. And completion dates for recommendations or deficiencies also need to be included in this report. Again, assigning someone a responsibility to follow up and make sure it gets done is the most effective way to do that. For employee participation, frequently a written plan is not documented or not shared with personnel. And that goes for all these program elements. They should be fully aware of where this information is located at the facility or corporate-wide, and they should have full access to this. It's their right to have full access to their safety and what the company is doing for their safety and for operations. Personnel involved with the cover process always should be aware of these programs, again, and know where the documentation is. They should be involved with the program development, especially the operators. They're frequently the people that know the most about how the system is working and maybe any nuances. Or they're out in the field every day. They know what may be underperforming. There may be a valve that's about to break, and they may be able to tell that and report back. So you want to involve them in this whole process. It's really important to get their input. And the documentation needs to be in the language, again, of the operator or user. Going back to people who don't speak English fluently or as a first language, that all needs to be translated for them somehow, and it's really important to note that. For the hot work permits, personnel should be trained and knowledgeable in the procedures, and they should be documented, and records should always be kept on file. I believe the best standard practice is to keep them on file for several years. I know a few facilities that I work with directly will keep them on file for the life of the process. So it's implied that you need to keep them on file for a lengthy amount of time. It's really up to the discretion of the operator or the management, but that may change as changes to regulations develop over time. And also the hot work area should be field verified by a supervisor. For contractors, there should be documentation regarding their training, so any kind of training certificates, same as you would for your own employees, and keep those on file. It should be the same for the contractors. And it is the owner's or operator's responsibility to collect those documents. So if the contractor's not offering them up on, and let's just say they do annual training, you need to be asking for them. It's your responsibility to have those on file and to make sure that they're up to date. There's also, there's frequently a lack of safety training. A lot of accidents happen because contractors or operators are not trained appropriately. So this is all part of the verification process and documentation. And there's also a periodic evaluation of contractors that should occur. You should be evaluating them on their safe practices, field verification for checklists once a year. And if you have different contractors from the same company coming out, you should evaluate each one of them. And the contractor or the company may have their own method of doing that as well, and so it's always important to keep those lines of communication open. Emergency planning and response. You should understand the difference between an emergency response plan and an emergency action plan. Although there's a slight difference between the two, there are some distinguishing documentation differences and requirements. So knowing the difference and having the correct plan in place are the first steps. In meeting the requirements by any other agency. So if you have any local agencies, a local fire department that require you to do more, do something different, you need to be talking with them as well because they may be assisting you with any kind of accident or emergency response, and you need to have open lines of communication with them. The contact information should always be up to date in these plans. If there's a personnel change, that should mean a change to emergency plan. There's an annual review that should be done. Again, a real easy sign-off sheet that it was conducted, one of the attachments or whatnot. It's very effective to just document that you've reviewed it, there were changes, and they were made, or there were no changes. And also training on the emergency plan is really important. If you have an evacuation plan but no one knows where to meet and evacuate to, it does nobody any good. So it's really important to train and to coordinate with local agencies, the local fire department, the local hazmat team, whoever it is that you need to be coordinating with. And that should be documented as well. That is a new CalARP requirement to document the coordination between the groups. Again, it could be an email saying, hey, we're so glad you came over the other day or whatnot, and a little signed report or whatever it may be, but it does need to be in writing somewhere. And definitely written response procedures. You can't just verbally inform people of what to do. It needs to be a written plan. It needs to be put together. Now in California, they have listed community emergency plans, hazmat area plans, and business plans as qualifying for this requirement. So you do have some other options if you already have one of those plans in place. However, there's still required elements that if they're missing, you may have to develop and include either as attachments or as a separate plan. So the most common program-wide deficiency that we saw here in the list was the recommendation follow-up. To elaborate on that, one of the easiest things to do is assign an individual for recommendation completion. And there should always be an anticipated date of completion that follows the regulatory compliance and also that's been verified with the administrative agency or with the local CUPA that they agree with the timeline of these anticipated dates. It's really important to make sure you're coordinating with your local agencies, with the people that will be responding to your facility, and with the people that are governing your facility. Documentation should address recommendations when they are closed. They should be labeled as such and the date they were closed. And again, the responsible person or the individual should always be listed on that somewhere. And so the underlying theme here today was basically no documentation means that there's a deficiency. If it's not in writing, I always think of it as, if it was a legal matter. If it's not in writing, it doesn't count. You need to be able to defend in concrete evidence that you've been doing what you're supposed to be doing according to regulations. Even if that's a little bit of an overload of paperwork, or you print out an extra email that was sent, or you have to write up a memo and put that in the file. That little bit of extra effort will save you a lot of effort later when an agency comes to your site, your facility, and asks for your documentation, you're missing it, and then you start seeing citations, or they are offering recommendations, and you got to go back and do it again. And you got to go and maybe go backwards in time, remember what happened, and reproduce the document. So it's always easier to do it in the time and in the fact rather than after the fact. So we'll go ahead and talk about the regulatory updates that are occurring federally and statewide in California. Right now, the current modernization efforts include 6 agencies that are all working together. Some, as you can see from the diagram, some are federal, some are state agencies. Some are just the interagency working group and the chemical safety board are kind of outside of that as almost private agencies, even though they do have public influence. So right now with the agencies, the CSB just had a hearing on January 28th. The final report was voted on unanimously and published. It had key findings that were both previously listed in the draft as well as new findings that were not. So I encourage everyone to read or at least skim this if they have the time to do so. The interagency working group still has meetings that are continuing. There are no additional reports planned for the agency, but that could always change. And the U.S. EPA and the federal OSHA have both received all their RFI comments. They've been closed, and they're still reviewing and producing a draft report on them. So as far as the regulations go, right now we're looking at 3 initiatives between OSHA, EPA, and CalOSHA. OSHA has 3 independent initiatives, EPA has 9 independent initiatives, and CalOSHA has 12 independent initiatives. And what this means is that those initiatives do not overlap with any of the other 2 programs or the 2 agencies and what they want done. So for PSM, there are potentially 15 more initiatives or elements that could require, have requirement for facilities to meet, as well as 9 EPA or RMP requirements. For the CalOSHA PSM, basically what they're doing is they're setting up a new regulation. It'll be 8 CCR 5189.1 for highly hazardous materials and petroleum facilities. And don't let this confuse you why we included it in the ammonia refrigeration webinar today. Going forward, and I'll explain a little bit more on another slide, but this could all potentially be applicable to everyone, not just refineries. So it's important to keep this all in mind while we're talking about these regulation changes. So as of October 31st of last year, there was a draft that was produced and published, and there are comments now being processed on the regulation. Right now we're looking at the final promulgation to be the 1st or 2nd quarter of 2016. So it'll be next year. So a year from now you could be looking at new PSM regulations. There will be initially 2 PSM requirements. So again, they're the acutely hazardous materials, which is what ammonia facilities currently fall under. And then there will be the highly hazardous materials, which are typically what their categories are refineries in. But again, it's important to note that these could overlap at some point, and general duty clause could make it a requirement that ammonia facilities meet these requirements for what they're saying are for refineries. And there's no current mechanism right now to synchronize the CalARP regulations with the federal regulations. For the CalARP regulations recently, again, we talked about the January 15th update that the new regulations went in place. There are amendments. There's an amendment document and the new full text of the regulations available on CalOES website. And you'll see in I think a slide or 2, I do have a references page that has the link to that page. There's an additional update they're seeing as needed to address the initiatives by CalOSHA. So they're going to try to synchronize with the PSM regulations. There's a draft of an additional update that they're anticipating for spring of this year, so we're right into it. We'll be checking on more. We have another webinar in a couple months where we'll probably report back on that. And they're likely going to promulgate this regulation after the CalOSHA PSM. They're planning no additional requirements for the high hazard facilities, but there's also no indication that they're going to try to synchronize with federal or CalOSHA. And so kind of summarizing the last 2 slides, what that means is that say ammonia facilities by general duty clause, if they're required to meet all these regulations, there could be 4 regulations on the federal and state levels in California that you could be required to meet with additional initiatives and additional elements. It's really important to stay on top of this because things could be changing very rapidly. So what should you be doing now? In California, basically adhere to the new requirements. Make sure that all your documentation is up to date, that you're meeting the timelines that are specified, that anything that was changed, that your program matches that, and do that as soon as possible. Again, the amendment page will help a lot. It's a strike-through document, so anything that was changed was either with a strike-through text or with an underlying text to indicate changes, and it was very easy. I reviewed it myself. It's very easy to follow it and go through where the changes were made and what those changes were. Also have an awareness for this new CalOSHA PSM regulation. Try to follow it as best you can, or tune in with us. We'll be providing updates as this changes. But these high hazard facilities, again, these regulations could carry back down to other industries very easily. So it's important to stay on top of it and make sure you know what's going on, especially if they have comment periods. It's your opportunity to comment on this stuff and make sure that you have a say in what the government's passing. Anticipate different federal and state regulations. Again, like we said, there's a potential for 4 regulations between federal and California state that may need to be met at one point. So anticipate that. Anticipate the effort. If that's coordination financially at a corporate level, that all needs to be taken into account, that there could be these issues later. Maybe something done in-house in the past is just getting too complicated to be done, and you need to find an expert or maybe coordinate better between facilities and do a corporate-wide initiative to cover all your facilities under one basic program with some changes between facilities. All that needs to be taken into account now and be thought about now. Again, keep monitoring the situation and anticipate a short turnaround for this implementation. It's not uncommon for these agencies to pass regulations and then say, oh yeah, and it needs to be done by the end of the year, and frankly don't have the time to really get it done. You may need to, and so it's important to really anticipate this. Again, if there's a financial barrier with corporate or something like that, to be able to make sure they're informed of all this and that they know these changes are going on as well as at the facility level. For the U.S. refrigeration facilities, again, monitoring the situation is the best thing you can do right now, and anticipate more long-term changes. Since California is really initiating a lot of this, it won't be surprising if federal follows suit. However, we don't anticipate that in any near future. But again, the general duty clause may require that you follow these regulations outside of California depending on your facility and practices. So keep that in mind. Again, this is applicable to everybody. Just because the regulation says refineries does not mean your local agency or state agency can't adopt them or tell you you need to meet those requirements just at a facility level. And here's the references page I talked about. It references our risk management professionals update page. We keep this updated as possible with any changes to regulations or any documents we find online. I also included a link to the enforcement alert. That is also listed on our blog that we started recently. And I posted a link to the revised CalARP regulations for those who are interested in reading both the amendment and the full text. So we have four webinars currently scheduled through May. The most relevant one would probably be the regulatory framework update on April 22nd. I encourage everyone to tune into that as best as possible. As always, we publish the webinar online as a video, and we can make the presentation available for that. But there's also some other presentations and webinars coming up. If you're interested, I posted the dates here. And with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. Ivan will be helping field the questions today.
All right, so we already have one question. It was mentioned that all recommendations from compliance audits must be completed within a 1.5-year time frame. Can we provide more details?
The 1.5-year time frame is what's required by the regulation. Again, you had those options of coordinating with the administrative agency or during the next turnaround. So if there's a change that needs to be made, especially if it's documentation, it probably shouldn't take you a full 1.5 years to complete. But if it's something with the equipment or a practice or a training, they're giving you adequate time to be able to meet that requirement. And that's in the CalARP regulations. I think federally it's still kind of left to interpretation. But in general, it's a good timeline. It's half the timeline between the next compliance audit, or if you're talking about the PHA or any of the 5-year updates, it's half the time between the current and the next one. So it's a relatively easy timeline to make for most things. If you need an extended timeline, That's where they kind of allow the agreement with the CUPA or the administrative agency, and it's definitely something you should talk to your local administrative agency about.
Another question is, you mentioned that administrative changes do not reset the anniversary date. Could you give a few examples of what would reset the anniversary date?
Yes, so resetting the anniversary date would be if you have an inventory change, where you have a complete change of the process. Anything that would change the population count, the kind of categorization of like different codes that the facility has to meet. So administrative changes are more on the order of changing a phone number, a name, a manager, a contact, things like that that are just record keeping. But any kind of facility change would be required to be reported, and the anniversary date would be updated. And there are options in the RMP reporting software to do that and to indicate that.
Are there criteria for contractor safety established for what the owner-operator needs to look at during the bidding process for contractor safety elements?
Contractor safety should be treated as your own employee safety. So anything that you would do to check or verify the safety of your employees, you should do for a contractor. That would typically include any kind of training certificates. If they have any certifications through outside agencies, I know IIAR and RETA both have certifications for operators and for maintenance personnel. Any information you can collect is always good. Knowing what kind of safety standards they have at a contractor level is very important. And just even keeping track of OSHA 300 logs. Whatever you can to make sure that your contractors bring the safety they can. They need to attend your personnel safety training. To be coordinated with your facility, or just a meet and greet so they know the operators, outside of work a little bit, maybe during lunch or something. All that's very helpful so you have a cohesive team together.
Another question that's come up is, have you ever ran into a situation where the initial PHA was lost, and how do you handle that?
So if you lose your PHA, the first thing you do is check, obviously if you've checked your records already, you don't have to, but maybe another person has a copy. That could be if you use an outside contractor or even a local CUPA. Try not to reproduce anything you don't have to especially if you're getting close to the next update. If you cannot find the records at all, you're going to have to reproduce it. However, if you're getting to the point where, let's just say you're a year from your anniversary and it's reproduced the old document, or just conduct the next one, it's probably easier to just conduct the next one and reset the anniversary date a little bit earlier. It's best practice to just kind of use your best judgment, but you don't make it harder than you can on yourself. But the CUPA can cite you, or the federal agency can cite you if you don't have it on file. So it's very important to get that straightened out as soon as possible.
Okay. Another question is, how are new codes updates to be handled from an audit if a facility has not made any plan changes or expansions requiring new building permits?
I believe, and my knowledge is a little fuzzy on how the codes work, but if you didn't have to get a building permit, you don't need to meet the most current codes necessarily. However, it's best practice. I know when you get like a building permit or something through the city to make a change, you will be required to meet the most recent standards. If it's just replacing equipment like kind for kind, that may not apply. I'm not an expert in building codes and the industry codes. That would probably be best directed to an engineering designer for these systems. But if it's best practice to upgrade, do a small upgrade to the codes that are current, and it's financially not a huge burden. It's probably best to do for safety's sake and for personnel and for the community.
Another question that's come up is, what are key tasks that can derail completion of a 5-year update?
Scheduling is a big one. Getting a group of people involved, let's just say for the PHA, like we talked about scheduling-wise, you could be looking at 3 months out to get a schedule together, prep time, PNIDs updated, whatever needs to be done before the process. When you're talking about a hazard assessment or off-site consequence analysis or even a seismic assessment, those can typically be turned around a little quicker. But again, it really comes down to schedule, especially like here at Risk Management Professionals when you have a contractor, helping you with the work or conducting the updates. You could have someone, we could have an office with no one available for a couple of weeks, and if you're waiting until the day before to try to get it done, it can be very difficult to do. So it's really important to just give yourself that cushion. Scheduling is always a big thing, and getting a turnaround on information is always big too. These reports can be submitted electronically at a federal level. That doesn't mean it's going to go smoothly. If they've shut down their systems for 24 hours and it's due that day, it's not going to do you any good. You're still going to be late on it, even if it wasn't your fault. So it's really important to think about all this in advance and make sure you have things done maybe ahead of time and with a quick turnaround if there's more information that's needed or something that needs to get.
Another question that has come up is if a site is closing/removing ammonia, what are the notification requirements?
I haven't had one of these in a while, but I believe a notification to CUPA. You also need to deregister through the federal EPA. I think the federal EPA, I believe, can be done electronically with a follow-up letter. But it's been a while since I've done one, and the CUPA, I believe, is also letter and conversation. I'm sure there are decommissioning requirements as well. Obviously, you got to use contractors to remove the ammonia that are qualified to do that. There are other little nuances like that, but I believe to deregister yourself and to remove yourself from the RMP CalARP program, all you need is basically written letter or memos going to the relative agencies.
And the final question I have currently, unless anyone enters any more in, are what are the consequences for submitting after the anniversary date?
Well, the short answer to that is you get cited. There are some agencies that will allow, if you've called them in advance, that you will be running late with the submittal. They'll give you a little bit of leeway knowing that you're working on it. However, it's never a good idea to wait that long. Again, like not waiting until the day of, like RMP submittal is due. They could have a computer shut down. They could be having IT problems on their end. Even if it's not your fault, you're still going to be late, and they still could cite you for that. It's always important to stay on top of this. It doesn't hurt to submit a little bit early. It doesn't hurt to get things done a little bit early. You may be pushing up your anniversary date a little bit, but in the grand scheme of things, you know it's done, you know you're on time, and you're not going to get a citation.
Okay, it does not appear like there are any more questions, so.
Okay. Well, I will be available via email, or if you'd like to call our general line, you can get in contact with me or anyone else here at the office. And thank you for viewing, and have a good rest of the day.